Welcome to this edition of The American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline, and I am president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men, each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then, as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of cultural and political change. Our project expands on that work as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading with a contemporary thought leader. My guests are from the fields of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they have generously agreed to share this time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect your faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American Purpose with my guest, Dr. Charles Davidson. He is Executive Director of the George Mason Carter School Political Leadership Academy and the President of ForgottenSong. Welcome, Charles, and thanks for being with us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So we're going to get right to it, and I'm going to ask you, in your opinion, what was the original national purpose of the United States?
So, sorry, I'm just a little bit in trouble with my lighting.
That's all right.
There we go. I stewed over this question a lot because I was having a hard time coming up with an answer in its most like literal sense, or are we talking figuratively, et cetera. And my mind immediately went to the original purpose of America being, the American colonists' response to what they perceived to be an unfair taxation system, and there was no representation that they agreed with for them in the parliament, and it transpired into this violent insurrection that then we became the United States. But I think that my answer had to dive a little bit beyond sort of like the literal answer to that, in that America became an idea of what it would mean for people with contesting ideas to have a space in which to exercise those ideas and to exercise that contest, to exercise that conflict. My job as a professor and in the nonprofit world is to examine conflict, and so a lot of the ways that I see the world are going to come back to that as being the human response to conflict. And America was then, and in different ways is now, founded on the idea that there will always be differing ideas about what the common good is. But America is unique in that it has at least attempted to provide a space to pursue that common good, even though people don't always agree on what it is.
So if that was our original national purpose, what ought to be the American purpose going forward?
Yeah, so I think where we've arrived, like if you ask that question, like, where do we go forward from today? You have to first describe what has led up to this moment in time that is particularly divisive, vitriolic, identity-based, kind of tribal-based in some ways.
We have time for that.
So we're in a unique time right now where the recognition of competing ideas has been thrust to the front of the American ideal because of the ease with which we can communicate with one another. These competing ideas of the common good have always been there. The competing ideas of what the government is supposed to do for the citizen has always been there, and what the citizen is supposed to do for the government. And we're unique in that we have grasped onto the idea that certain groups of people are going to think differently than other certain groups of people, and so we became a federated republic, right? Like it's a federation of other of states that have differing ideas about the common good. But where we kind of progressed was we started to group ourselves into more competing ideas, but a lot of times the conflict was sort of under underlying, sometimes unspoken. A lot of times it wasn't demanded that you pick a side and be judged based on your identity. But with the advent of social media and the ease with which we all communicate, we've arrived at a place where people are being more and more forced to choose sides. And then, I think it's another discussion for another time, but being punished for allowing any sort of constructive conversation to persist, because it seems to be this like betrayal of one's tribe or one's identity. So where we're at now and how we progress, what is the purpose of America now, I think is the question, right? We must return or develop on, if you want to think conservative or progressive, I'll give you both. Either return to or develop on our ability as a nation to provide a common place where differing perceptions of common good can be discussed without demanding destructive conflict of the other. We've devolved into othering people of differing opinions, and I think that should be our purpose now, is to return to a safer space to be able to govern ourselves with respect to that reality.
So I'm going to push forward on that a little bit, but I want to take a step back because what you said was fascinating. For a long time, I understood you to say the repository of these conflicts were primarily the states. And whatever was going on inside the states, it was the states that engaged in this conflict with each other. And we use conflict here not necessarily in any sense, but differing opinions. Not necessarily any kind of combat or a competition in which there can only be a winner and a loser.
Yeah, absolutely.
But we have reached a point now, I understand you to be saying, where we've both smoothed out the disagreements, the conflict, into two camps, and at the same time atomized it, so that we're no longer groups of people in states, but we have taken as the individual mission, the island unto myself, a place in one of these two camps, which have become far more contentious than merely conflictual. Mm-hmm. Do I have that right?
Yeah, I might push back a little in that there are only two camps. It's those two camps that are demanding the attention right now. So yeah.
But there are other camps as well.
Sure. Yeah, certainly.
Good. Excellent. All right. So tell me a little bit more about why that constitutes the purpose of the United States. Why must it be to promote conflict, but in a more genteel way?
Yeah. So I'm very passionate about this answer, and this has kind of helped us develop at the Carter School the mission of the Political Leadership Academy. That shameless plug there, but we as scholars and as practitioners of conflict analysis and resolution demand that we as an American people recognize that the strength of our republic, the very fabric of our republic, is built on the idea that there must be competing ideas. There must be differing opinions, and they must be given voice, or else we devolve into some form of authoritarianism where somebody's idea takes full control and there's no more competition. The essence of conflict, and again, I think it's really important that you delineated what I'm saying. When I say conflict, I'm saying it in this, differing ideas, not violent, punching and stealing, etc. But competing ideas will always result in, I shouldn't say always, but the point of conflict is that we would result in what is an acceptable conclusion or path forward for the greatest number of people based on the sharing of these ideas. And when you bring different lived experiences to the table, you get to challenge the lived experiences of those who are in power, or of the current members of our governing class, right? And if all we had was the governing class saying, this is how we're going to press forward, well, then we've devolved into what we were before the revolution, right? That was the very demand of our representation in England, was that somebody in England was representing us and they had no idea what it meant to be an American colonist. And so it kind of transfers us into this idea of what is democracy, right? People say we're a democracy. Well, actually, we're a republic. We govern through democracy, but the ideas of democracy writ large are actually quite different, and how it was first played out in ancient Greece. And as we press forward, yes, we send elected leaders, but it's not exactly pure representation. But if there is any hope that we have at sharing these ideas and in making this conflict constructive, it's through the process of democracy that has become, so integral to the foundation of and the present state of our republic.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the foundation and the foundational values we have. Some of them are admirable, and others of them not so much. Other than conflict, which appears to be, from your perspective, the underlying value that we practice as Americans, what are one or two values that are worth doubling down on in our day and age? Yeah.
So I think that this was it might have been the most challenging question as you proposed to me, that I don't think that there is like, this is my answer, right? But rather things to consider. I kept coming back to this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? And the challenge on the one hand is that we must double down on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We must, because that's where we originated, and that's really the only way forward for humankind. It's the only way that the individual finds him or herself positioned within the city, and the city within the state, and the state within the federation. The challenge is that somehow we've managed to come into conflict even with what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means. Like, we have wildly differing views on what happiness is. Let's see, who was it? Was it Aristotle that said happiness can be found in pleasure, honor, or I think money? And then I think later went on, as my friend described, to add a fourth one in contemplation. But pleasure, honor, and money, right? Those three things, just those three complicate the idea of happiness so much that we will never agree. Right. So do we double down on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Absolutely. Will that lead to more conflict? Yes, it will.
And what about a couple or three of the values that are holding us back from necessary progress?
Very challenging question. I think that it can be argued quite easily. So I recognize that before saying this, that there was a certain amount of individualism, not in the Constitution per se. I mean, the Constitution wasn't about individualism. It's not about the freedom of the person, even though there are freedoms. The Constitution was written, and the Bill of Rights was written to address larger issues than what it means to be an individual. But I think that there were certain undertones, especially that existed in society outside of the founding process, that had a lot to do with individualism, dating all the way back to the Pilgrims, who were kind of ostracized as a result of their differing beliefs, and it pressed forward into things like the Protestant work ethic, or the Protestant ethic, and responses of the founding fathers to some of the classic ideas of what governance meant. There were these undertones of individualism that I think in some ways contributed to what we see today as being the hyper freedom and individuality of the individual, regardless of their ramifications on the rest of society, as being one of the founding beliefs that not necessarily is always going to be good. That at some point, self-sacrifice is going to come into play for the greater good, and defining what that common good looks like is our challenge.
That is indeed a challenge. I've had a lot of different answers on this question, so don't feel that you've proposed something that is so controversial that it's going to lead to contention rather than just conflict.
Yeah, right.
So you mentioned the Bill of Rights and the rights that are enumerated in the rest of the Constitution as well. Most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize our community. But the first freedoms in the Bill of Rights are very personal. The freedom of religion, the freedom of conscience. You yourself profess a faith. What values that are rooted in your personal belief system do you commend to those who don't share those personal beliefs that you have?
Yeah. So there's two that really come to mind, and I will gladly expound upon others. But number one is, it actually does respond to my previous answer about individualism, in that the way that my faith informs that problem, if you will, is that the way that you express. I'm a Roman Catholic, by the way, and if for anybody who's listening, like I ascribe to Catholicism, so that there's no mystery. But it addresses these issues of individualism that, in my opinion, the way I interpret my faith is that if you want to live out your individualism, you do so through serving others. So if you want to make something, if you want to make an effect on the common good, if you want to make an effect on those around you, change your society, you serve others, and you choose to use your gifts, talents, privilege, resources to make those around you happier, more full of life, and experiencing more liberty, if you will. And that ties into Catholic social teaching, which I think gets a bit more, answering the question about how America was set up to govern. And that is, we're founded on this idea of subsidiarity. And it's a thing that's thrown around a lot by conservatives. I think oftentimes it can be abused in sometimes really quite heinous ways. But ultimately, if we are going to allow individuals to have an effect on our society, we have to allow for subsidiarity of government to trickle down. Allow the town that disagrees from the state to govern itself differently based on the majority of opinions. Allow the school board that differs from the town to govern its school differently based on their perceptions of what is good. Where I am then challenged by that in my faith is that Catholicism is very based on the idea of the group, right? I mean, it's what is it? 1.4 billion people proclaim to be Catholic, and ultimately you're going to have this interplay of what it means to pursue sanctity as an individual, what it means to pursue life as an individual and to serve others as an individual, as opposed to what it means to sacrifice to the common good. And that's where my challenges of identifying with one party or the other really do. It's extremely challenging for me. I've rarely done that, and I think it's a result of this belief that I have that regarding political parties or political sides, God is not on one. God is on God's side, and any party that chooses for whatever reason to say one way or the other is just absolutely wrong, because both sides echo the virtues that I ascribe to what God calls us to be. Neither does it perfectly.
I hear in your discussion of the tension between the individual and the community in the Roman Catholic Church the same tension that you were discussing as to where we've arrived as Americans in our tension between the individual and the collective sense of being a part of the American experiment. So it's good to know you're consistent.
I appreciate it.
Charles, how should our society pursue our national purpose? What should we be doing?
Yeah. Again, with the extremely hard to answer questions. But no, these were incredibly insightful. I've really enjoyed thinking through them. My opinions are many because I think about this all the time, in my profession. What should we be doing? I think that we should be turning down the temperature. What does that look like? I don't know. I mean, there's going to be, for every answer, there's going to be kickback. How do we explore the difference between freedom and security? I don't know. I think that there's many answers to that question. But I think that that's part of this turning down the temperature of like, can we find a way to bring conversations back to the table that address each other's humanity first, citizenry second, and perceptions of the good third. Where I see it being upside down is that everyone says, this is what I think is good. This is what I know to be good. I am unwilling to listen to your answers about what is good for our society. And therefore, I will place that above your humanity, and I will place that above your citizenry. You are neither human nor American if you are not willing to acknowledge my good. How do we flip that back? How do we address people as people and Americans first, and then discuss the common good? My answer, instead of just saying it's too hard to answer, is we develop with skill forums, locations. I don't like using the word safe spaces because somehow even that has been politicized, but you know what I mean when I say that.
I know what you mean.
For people to recognize each other's humanity and citizenry first. And I've thought about starting my own podcast or writing a book about that features people of dramatically different perceptions of the good, and then having them come on to a podcast or whatever and talk about football or beer or something, musical theater, anything that they find common ground in that can help awaken this idea of the common bond of humanity. Why do we do this? Why do we need this? It's because conflict in so many ways is tied to consciousness. I cannot remember the author's name, but they talk about 5 levels of consciousness that go from a day-old infant to somebody who can think critically about how other people's consciousness affects their own. And there's these steps in between. But how do we move society to address levels of consciousness in others and recognize that they are humans, they are Americans who are going through processes of trying to grasp what they feel convicted by as the common good, and then finding places where we meet and then going from there.
I want to caution you about that podcast idea. My brother Rich and I agree on humanity. We agree on citizenry. We even agree on what the common good is. But he's a Chicago White Sox fan, and I'm a Chicago Cubs fan.
Oh,
and there's more conflict there than there is in any of those other things. So.
That's really funny. So, I won't ask where you lived, though, because there might be some loyalty problems there, right?
So the society needs to do that, but what about the individual? What role does the individual play in pursuing our national purpose?
Yeah. So I'll stick to my guns on what I was just saying, and that where does the individual role? Where does the individual find? Where does the individual find their role in that process?
Right.
The individual has to come to terms with the fact that humility and patience are going to be absolutely necessary in order for them to enter the fray of these new communicative processes. I think it's silly to say new. These communicative processes are absolutely not new. They're not new at all, but they are necessary at this point. And the only way to proceed toward humility is through listening. the individual will be the cause of this transformation. If the transformation in our nation takes place, which I think it will, I think it's going to happen. But it will not take place. These massive writ large actions do not take place absent of the individual. The individual is the absolute largest entity that can be the largest entity necessary for these changes to take place ends at the individual. You can't say, well, this group is going to change, or that church is going to change, or this faith is going to change, because the faiths, the churches, the groups are all made up of individuals. And if the individual doesn't change, it doesn't change. So the individual, it has to learn how to listen, and not hear, but really take the time to process what is being told to them, to empathize, to try and discover perceptions of the common good in the other, and then react, and then communicate. To discover that, as St. Augustine said, we are all in pursuit of what we feel is good. If the individual can learn about somebody else's totally opposite perception of good, if at least they can learn why the person thinks that's good, then that's the first step.
Great. It's terrific. Are you optimistic about America's future?
I am. Is it optimism based on how do I say this? I'm not trying to pump myself up when I say this. Is what I'm trying to say. Like it's not like I'm forcing. Like, yeah, I'm optimistic. I'm hopeful. Like I'm really excited about this. But why I'm optimistic is sort of the evidence that's being presented to me. I'm a scholar, right? I'm a scholar, and it was. I rarely take things at face value, and even in my faith. Like, that's why I so enjoy being a Catholic, because there's so much to investigate in the history of our faith. But I see changes, and I see the types of steps that are being taken. By the way, I don't use the word progress in this, because I think that the idea of progress is an elusive one, and it implies that we as a nation are going somewhere, and there's some sort of relative closeness to another goal that I don't think will ever be met. So like the idea that we are progressing, I think just has to be like unpacked, and that's why I oftentimes don't use it, even though I understand like why it's used. So if we're going to progress, I see evidence in society of things taking place, of people bending, of groups of individuals saying certain things that are indicating that we as a society actually aren't willing to cave in on ourselves. We're not willing to take tribal identity to the grave. Some are, but I think the majority aren't. And it pops up in little ways that you would never expect. I'm from Arkansas, and things that I've learned about Arkansas politics recently have quite frankly shocked me. Really local, nuanced things, right? But still, nonetheless, it's like, I think what we're told is that we're all kind of heading toward this like scorched earth peace, right? Where like everything's demolished, but it's peaceful now, this idea of ultimate negative peace is actually not what I'm seeing. There are actually things that are happening that are in pursuit of positive peace, where like structures and systems ever so slightly are shifting to where more and more people are being afforded the opportunity to speak. They're being listened to, and people's ideas of good are expanding, albeit, as I said, slowly. So yeah, I'm optimistic.
It's the both the opportunity and the challenge of this era of instant communication, where you can hear anybody say anything you want.
Yeah. And the incendiary things make the news, right?
Right.
Heinous things make the news, and it sucks, but yeah.
All right, so I'm going to let you go in a second, but not before I ask you about ForgottenSong,
Sure.
which is an intriguing name. Can you tell us just a little bit about it?
Yeah, it's so the organization I founded in 2009 officially. We work with the idea that doing sustainable peace building practice can be possible in even the worst places in the world. And by worst, I mean most actively conflicted. It's an organization that's built on the idea that local peace building processes and the success of peace building already exists in the minds of people who are experiencing conflict. We as an organization go in search of those ideas of local people experiencing conflict, and we say, how can we help you? We're trying to revolutionize the way that peace building is thought of internationally, in that we think it's a mistake when people like ourselves in the West go to places elsewhere and say, we have answers for you. Listen to us and peace will come. As a peace builder, I think it's totally upside down. Instead, we find ourselves to be an NGO that's focused totally on listening to what already exists in the minds of others, and then equipping through different mechanisms those peace building practices. So for instance, right now, while we've worked in places like Uganda, Northern Iraq, Burundi, etc., we are currently working in the Eastern Democratic Republic of the Congo with former child combatants, some people say child soldiers, who have identified, they left the militias and they identified a path out for other child combatants. They identified systems that they can integrate into local villages that can accept these child soldiers back into their societies through these types of economic peace building initiatives that have to do with like business investment, education, psychological reintegration for both the village and the children. And we got into contact with them, these former child soldiers, and we're like, this idea is great. How can we make this grow? And so we bring our resources, we bring our business strategies, we bring our understanding of peace building processes writ large, and build on these ideas. So we've seen just like amazing things happen in whole villages regarding the reintegration of former child soldiers, and we've seen hundreds of kids be able to lay down arms and reintegrate back as children and as young adults into active society, and it's just been amazing. And that's just the one story of the Congo. We've worked elsewhere.
It's worth a whole nother conversation, which unfortunately I don't have time for right now, but that's one of the reasons I recommend State of Belief. You'll show up there to talk about this, I'm sure of it. Yeah. I want to thank you for being with us, and thanks to you, our listeners, for engaging with us and exploring the American purpose. It's been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with Dr. Charles Davidson, who has shared his perspective so generously. You can listen to this and other episodes at AmericanPurpose.org and learn more about our work at stateofbelief.com and interfaithalliance.org. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.